Welcome to the Mike and Doug Show. I'm Doug. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Doug.
Oh my gosh, today, full disclosure on what I think you and the miners have strangely named fake Jews. And it's going to go all the way from Babylon, the ancient old Babylon, into our modern times, and right on up to the apocalyptic horror of Babylon. Because you have discovered the original sources of the evil that we have been trying to penetrate now here for some years, working in our time and working backwards. But now you've taken it back so far that you've uncovered the mystery of what people call the Khazarian Mafia or the Ashkenazi Jews or the whatever. Today, we're actually going to hear the truth about that, which in fact is such a revelation that people better hang on to their hats. So, what have you and the miners dug up? Because you started here in America, you dug down so deep you came out in China.
Yeah. Well, I think the moral of this story is don't prod a civil engineer to figure this stuff out because we will. And we have. And it is, the revelations are shocking to me. But on the other hand, it does make sense what's going on here. You know, over the recent years, it's really been interesting to hear people describe what they are seeing in the weird behaviors of many of our leaders as demonic. They describe it as demonic, and they see some sort of driving force that's way beyond anything a normal human being would do or be involved in, and yet this behavior continues on through the generations. Now we started looking at the current generation and looking why this group of elites in Washington stole our social networking technology. And now what we're doing, as you say, is we're coming out on the other end of the world and seeing the source of this demon. And it's fascinating to see that the historical record so well documents this demon, and yet it is so confused and discombobulated and censored and obfuscated by it's millennia of historians who tell us the pieces and the parts, but they never put it together, except with a few exceptions. We have found one very fascinating. She looks like she's Turkish, historian from 1888 that did put it together. And what she discovered, I'm just going to bottom line a little bit of this. She discovered that the ancient bankers of Babylon were identified as Jewish. They were attached directly to all of the kings and princes of Babylon, and their practices were discovered in 1847, I believe. They discovered thousands of clay tablets of the secret archives of these banks. There's more than one. And in those archives, we see exquisitely detailed transactions of every aspect of life in Babylon. And in that, what we see is a contemporary record that I you could easily be reading about something that J.P. Morgan's doing just down the road. Nothing has changed in the banking practices of Mammon to this day. And I think that's the big revelation here, that we have found the thread that by which Mammon has controlled humanity ever since about 2000, 3000 BC. I mean, you pick your date. But we have to give a shout out to John Barnwell, because in I used to tease him of always wanting to take every story back to the Hammurabi Code. And as you may or may not know, the Hammurabi Code was, I gotta get this. Hammurabi Code was the law of Babylon, written about 2000 BC, and in that law was a permission for the bankers of that time to charge interest on loans. And that simple act has plagued humanity until now. And what we have seen, what we saw about 500 years into that, we saw an explosion of activity among the prophets of Israel, where they were condemning that practice, and they were telling people not to engage in interest-bearing loans, and they did anyway. And these Jewish bankers, which I don't think they were, I think they were actually Persian Babylonian bankers that called themselves Jews, and their records don't show any attention to the admonitions of the prophets, and they specifically don't talk about the solution to the problem of compound interest, which was to call every 7 years for a day of jubilee or a year of jubilee where the debts were wiped out. Then everybody's debts were wiped out. Now, whether that happened or not, I don't know, but it's in the scriptures in Deuteronomy that was clearly called for. And it looks like, Douglas, and I'm going to really bottom line what I think our solution is. And I think our solution is we need to see a year of Jubilee declared on the whole planet. And if we do that, we will stop the demon of mammon in his tracks in 2022. I don't know how that's going to happen, but that's what needs to happen.
You know, Rudolf Steiner said that the source of evil in economics is if money makes money for doing nothing. And that's what banking is about. Money
Right.
making nothing. That's what usury is. That's what money lending is. That's what we call money mongers, money grubbers. And it always attracted with the Babylonians, which you have pointed out are called Rodanites, with the Rodonite Babylonian / fake Jews. They were in exile, of course, during the first section of the exile. There's like 3 sections of the captivity, what they call captivity. Look closely; they're not captive; they're running the place.
Yeah. There were Jewish bankers running Babylon at the time of the captivity. So I'm beginning to think that many of the things that we're looking at in terms of the ancient world and the emergence of scriptures and God's voice to humanity were obscured and obfuscated by the powers that be, who wanted to maintain this power over humanity through usury. And usury is the term that they used, and interest-bearing interest loans. Now, the curious thing, just kind of, we're roaming in history right now, but the Knights Templar, after the victory in the First Crusade, actually created the first no-interest loan bank in the world. And it was countering this thousands of years of usury that was being pushed out of Babylon.
And then it's just amazing to see that these Rodanites in Babylon.
Can I point out what that means? When we say Rodonite, I always get confused. But when you see these terms, you don't have anything to hook it to. Rodonite, Rodon was simply an area in Babylon. It was like a suburb of Babylon. So when you see Rodonite Jews, when you hear that, what they're really saying historically is they came from Babylon. These were not people who came from Israel.
Yes. And they had their little communities, and sometimes the rich elite area for the supposed Hebrews in exile in Neo-Babylon, the second Babylon, they lived in these areas where that was where the elite lived. That's where the rich lived. They took care of all the land holdings. They took care of collecting the taxes. They took care of banks, and they took care of the monarch. And Daniel was the prophet at the time, and he was basically the chief counselor to Nebuchadnezzar. And Ezekiel had a lot to say. There was much said about not captivity, but the time, we should call it, the time in Babylon, and then the time in Assyria. And when they went to Assyria, holy moly, Esther married the king of the Persian Empire at the time, the leftover element of the Assyrian. So basically, Esther became the wife of the king. How is that captivity? And when you own everything, and then when the Silk Road started in about 135 BC or so, these Rodenites went up to the Silk Road and they learned the language. Why don't you tell us about the Sogdians and how they connect to that?
135 BC. Maybe you meant 1000 BC. It's more like 1000 BC.
Well, the
It was
trading,
about, go ahead.
the official opening was somewhere in the 2nd century BC, but it goes back a long time. And wherever
Yeah,
there
it
was
goes
trade,
back
I
before.
should qualify that because the Rodenites were also involved in the trade with the Romans, who founded in 747 BC, and the many other groups. They wherever there was trade, wherever there was merchants, they had learned from the Canaanites because, of course, the Palestine is right next to what used to be the kingdom of the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians ruled the waves. They ruled the water. They were the ultimate merchants, and they worshipped also, as you pointed out, Mammon, and they worshipped Moloch. They offered their children in human sacrifice, blood sacrifice, and basically really, when you started this off, you pointed out that people say that the modern fake Jews, calling themselves Ashkenazi or whatever they want to call them, Khazarians, or they could be
Very few
called,
call them Khazarians.
yeah, no, unless they have some reason for it, like with the Jews in Nazi times, if they could prove they're Khazarian, they didn't get locked up because they were actually Aryan, because the Khazarians are actually what is an incursion not only into the language but the culture of Iran, which is Indo-Aryan. So when you're
Mhm.
talking about the Khazarians, you're also talking about hardly being able to tell them from the Indo-Aryans or the whole Aryan myth. And
Right.
so these myths of the Aryan fighting with the Semites, the Aryans and the Jews, that isn't really far from reality, but we now have found out that they somewhat merged together at some point. But anyway, the point is, going back to the Rodenites, they were on all the merchant trails, this Silk Road, anything going anywhere, and they were the money changers, the
And they
currency.
had agents all over Europe, going all the way up in England, Spain. They were the Silk Road traders, and that existed all over Europe and all over the Middle East, all over the Far East, the Eurasia, all the way to China. This was a very active group of people that called themselves Jews. But what we're seeing in this latest these latest genetic studies is that no, they're more Persian, they're more Khazarian. They even have Chinese strains from some of them lived in China. So what's confusing is this term Jewish. What does it mean? And we know what it means from the Exodus story, but after that, what happened? And that's the thing that we're beginning to conclude is that when the Jews moved into Canaan, they they took over that area, and then they began to fan out over the centuries. And keep in mind, it's not a huge walk to go from Jerusalem to Babylon. I mean, you can do it. It may take you a month or two, but it's not that far. So the idea of migrating to these places is kind of dumb. They walked there, and it wasn't that big of a walk. Um, and so what we see is that what happened was there was a great mix of the bloodlines of all these peoples all over the Middle East, and wherever the migrants who originally came from Palestine or Israel they ended up becoming the bankers of those locations. And what's fascinating about what we've just discovered is that in the mid 1800s, or in 1847, there was a huge find of archives of two very prominent Jewish banking families in Babylon. One was the Agibi family, which has its root in the name Joseph, and then the other one is the Marusha family. And these were two families that existed between about the 6th and the 8th century. For hundreds of years, they were the chief bankers of Babylon. Now, they identified themselves as Jewish, but from everything we can tell, they had no interest in Judaism. These were the bankers. Now, this is fascinating to me as somebody who's tried to study the Bible, that when we see this great explosion of the Old Testament and all the minor prophets and all the railing of the prophets calling the Jewish people to repentance and to following God. One of the things that they specifically railed against was usury and the charging of interest, and they called it unfair, they called it predatory, they called it exploitive. And yet, the very people that they were complaining about were these two big Jewish banker families in Babylon by the name of Agibi and Manashu. And we have specific details. They are so detailed that even the historian who one of the historians who's written about this said we could reconstruct the entire life of these people in that time and in that age. Now, think about that today. Could you reconstruct 300 or 400 years of your family just like that? These tablets let us do that with those two very powerful families who were managing Babylon. Now, were the Babylonians different? Were they specifically choosing Jews to do it? I don't think so. I think they were choosing their own, and these people who called themselves Jews figured out this system whereby they could run the banking, run the taxing, run the engineering, all aspects of the society for the current king and whoever that was at the time. And as long as they were collecting the taxes, which they also did, and charging loan interests, loaning money, giving letters of credit, doing letters of lading, you name it. What we see in these records is an exact duplicate of what's going on today, and specifically with the sin, the mammonic sin of compound interest. And they were allowed to do it. And then when the person could no longer pay, they drove him into slavery. What we see in these records is a extensive discussion of how to handle slaves, how to take men, castrate them, make them eunuchs, how to trade and market in boys and girls and women, prostitution. These were all part of their banking records, Douglas. And these were Jewish bankers. I don't think they were Jewish. I know a lot of very righteous Jews, and they didn't act like this. So what we see here is a deception of the greatest kind, in my opinion, and we see the spirit of Mammon, the demon of Mammon, emerging today with exactly the same practices as he did 2,000 or 3,000 years ago.
I imagine we're going to have to talk about this a few times because there's so many
I do too.
amazing details.
We're ranging in history like crazy.
So many,
here.
I've been following this research y'all are doing, and just the details in my head are exploding right now. If people could understand this, there's no question about this once we realized what was going on. For instance, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar said, "Shame on you, Jews. You keep going to the temple prostitutes. You're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to mix with other races. Oh, shame on you, Jews. You're too much into the worship of mammon and money and putting people into debtor prison. Shame on you, Jews." They kept. So what is it? Is it that the Jews, supposedly, let's call them Hebrews, did the Hebrews convert to the worship of Babylonian mammon? That's what happened, folks. It wasn't, and remember that there's injunctions to breed the Hebrew out of the Hebrew nation. And so they realized that the Hebrews had very smart minds, had really amazing prophets who could actually help the king plan. Remember what Joseph did for Egypt, what Daniel did to Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel did for Darius. They controlled the kingdom. They told the king what to do. Okay, so why is that? Because we could go into that, but there's a certain mental intelligence that came along with Abraham, and the fact that he did certain things to enhance the ability for objective thinking. No images, one God. Get rid of the pantheon. No images, no iconoclasm, on and on and on. These things built up the mind of a Hebrew. And I should make the clear distinction because there are so many types of Jews. Holy moly. I can't list all the types of Jews, and each one of them obfuscates their history.
Right.
Every single one, and almost every single thing you read about DNA or haplogroups is definitive for everybody else except who? Ashkenazi, Khazarian, supposed Jews, which we now call fake Jews, because let's just go over it. Who has the most Hebrew blood in them? Number one, Hebrews in Ethiopia, in Aksum, where supposedly the Queen of Sheba came back having the son of Solomon. They have, what is it, less than 10%. Then there's the Samaritans. They have less than 10%. And that's high. But if you read what the supposed European Ashkenazi, we would say slash Khazarians have, they're going to say 50% R1A, which is a marker for the Levant, which is, generally Palestine. So they would have 50% of that, 50% European. Okay, I can tell you right now that's a big fat lie. Because those Khazarians, those Ashkenazi that moved into the Rhine Valley, into Cologne, into Worms, into Mainz, into Speyer, and came out of Italy, out of Lucca, Italy, who followed the Roman paths, well, they all came from Babylon, and they all came from the Radhanites. So by the time they came through Turkey and all the way across and followed with the Romans and so on and so forth, they were so watered down that to say they're 50% Hebrew marker in their haplogroup is complete nonsense. So that's why I'm pointing out, if you want to do this research, good luck. If Michael didn't have 150 gnomes working for him, he could have never got this to the bottom of this information, because I had tried to study this many times, and all I could say is, somehow the bankers in Babylon, but I didn't know that they were an elite class of Hebrews who probably had already inbred with the Babylonians and changed over to worship Mammon, which they were told not to do again and again, and Moloch. How many times do the Jews have to be told, or the Hebrew nation have to be told, don't worship the golden calf, don't worship the bull, don't worship Moloch, stop worshiping Baal, who we now call Beelzebub, stop worshiping, well, really, it's also Lucifer. So in the modern times, they say they worship Lucifer. That's the pride. If you had and on the Silk Road, the Sogdians and the Jews, supposed Jews, they actually called Radhanites at that point. The Sogdians and the Radhanites had their own language that nobody else could speak. They controlled the whole thing. They had fortified cities. Basically, it started city-states built based upon trade, just like before there were city-states in Phoenicia and in Canaan, and just like later there was the places that the Templars started their headquarters in, all the cities all the way to Jerusalem, then became banks, and then those became cities, and they became fortified cities. It's the same thing. When you go away from an empire and a king and you go to a city-state, well, a small person could rule that small city-state, and guess who ruled them all? They ruled it because they learned the languages, they learned the culture, they interbred with them as they were not supposed to, and they always longed to go back and build the temple, which they weren't supposed to, and so they destroyed it. Their enemies destroyed it. They built it back. Their enemies destroyed it. How many times did the Hebrew nation have to be told, follow the rules? Well, they took the Hammurabi rules, and they went crazy, took it to the Silk Road, took it to Europe, took it to Khazaria, took over everything.
Once they learned the magic of compound interest, in other words, you're paying interest on interest, and eventually the original principal ceases to be the major amount you owe, and then it's just compounded interest, so that you can never get out of it. That's debt slavery. Once they learned that in Babylon, they've never given it up, and that's the one thing we're seeing. We're seeing this consistency of behavior that's way beyond a human being. This is mammon. This is who we're fighting right now. And specifically, the Jewish prophets said that the way to get over that is to declare the 7-year year of Jubilee, where the debts are forgiven. It's doubtful that ever happened, but that was what they called upon in Deuteronomy 12, I think it is, and that was written about 600 BC. So what we're experiencing today is exactly the same banking conduct as they were railing against back 600 years before Christ. And what did Christ say? You can't serve God and mammon. He specifically said that. And yet, what are we doing today as Christians, as human beings on this planet? We've given in to this charging of compound interest. We're all slaves to this system. And the Bible gave us a solution, the year of Jubilee. And I think that is our way out of this. Because what have we seen? We've seen that the much of the world's value has been gobbled up by the likes of BlackRock and J.P. Morgan and T. Rowe Price and Vanguard and Goldman Sachs. What if all these debts, these compound interest debts that they're holding for countries and individuals and companies all over the planet had to be forgiven? It would completely change the landscape, upend the landscape. Just like Jesus upended the money lenders in the temple. That's what has to happen. They have to be upended.
Well, it's beautiful because every time that there's a 7-year period in the past, the Jews had the option, if they wanted to follow the law, the Hebraic law, they would have to forgive at least their own Jewish brothers, Hebrew brothers, their debt. And if they did, what would they do? Then basically, they keep their community alive. They look after their people first. And when you talk about who owns mainstream media, that's every one of them is a Jew, what we'd call today a Jew.
I think they're fake Jews.
They're fake Jews.
I don't think they're real Jews.
That's right. That's what I'm going to point out. And also there's one guy, there's one guy who's not a Jew. But how about the bankers? Oh, no, go back to the original source. Most of them are Jewish, Italian Jewish, but for sure they claim to be Jews. They're fake Jews. Or look at the Rothschilds. They're Jews. Well, they're probably fake Jews. And when you see that they took on these Jewish names, these rabbi positions as
right.
what happened was, the big picture is the Turks used to have the kingdom that became the Silk Road, and the Turks and the Iranians. So the Iranians, the Persians, the Indo-Aryans created a group called the Sogdians. The Sogdians had their own little area, but they ruled a place on the Silk Road called Samarkand. Some will call it a Jewish city. Okay,
right.
So when you say Sogdian, you may be saying Jewish. But when
right.
you say Sogdian, they used a different language than everybody, and that was the language that controlled the entire Silk Road. If you didn't speak Sogdian, you didn't trade on the Silk Road. And
right.
so all the traders, all the merchants, all the slave traders, let's remember at that time when they brought in the metals and they brought in the axes and the swords, those were arms dealers. They brought in the coins.
They did the gunpowder. They did
the spices,
the perfumes, the spices, all the luxuries that the people of the West wanted from China were managed through those trade routes.
And they're slave traders. So basically, the Jews, if you want to call them that, let's call them Radhanites, let's call them Babylonian Mammon worshippers. They went up to the Silk Road. They learned the Sogdian language, and then they invented their own language called Yiddish. Yeah. And so they were able to do their own deals under the table with the Sogdians, maybe not knowing anything about them. What do we know about the Sogdians? Everything. What do we know about the Jews? Nothing. But they're almost one and the same. So when the Turkish Empire was taken in by the Tang dynasty of China, and then later the Muslims took it, it collapsed all the way back to the Caspian Sea. And so what happens? The rest of the Turks that survived went into what is now called Khazaria. And they basically had the end of the Silk Road that wasn't controlled by the Muslims, because the Muslims beat the heck out of the Sogdians. But guess what? Not one word about persecuting a Jew that I have read in any of the histories. So the Jews and speaking Sogdian and the Jews speaking Yiddish went into Khazaria. There was some messing around with them, the Muslims trying to convert them, and then one of their queens was a Jew, but the king wasn't a Jew, or the Kagan wasn't a Jew, but his wife was. So the Jews, they mixed, and then there's this whole thing that in 836, they put out a coin that said, "In Moses we trust," or no, what was it? In God, no, God's messenger is Moses. In Moses we trust. But really, that's what it's saying. But listen what they said. Moses is the messenger of God, not Allah. You never use the word messenger. No one ever called Moses a messenger. They call who a messenger? Muhammad.
Muhammad.
So it's a mixture of Jew, Muhammad, and Christianity all rolled into the little coin phrase, boom. And then what do they do with that? That doesn't mean anything because they go on for another, a couple hundred
Couple
years
hundred years.
practically until the
Right.
Russians come in, or the Rus, and beat them up, push them out. And what do? They go into Europe and they try to say that they're Ashkenazi Jews. Well, the Ashkenazi Jews has already gone to Khazaria, converted a lot of them, and so it's a lie. But they snuck in as being Jews. Khazarians did.
Well, that's what we're doing. We're roaming through big periods of history here, and it's a lot to keep straight. But one of the things that we see some real points of departure here, and the term Ashkenazi was not introduced until about 1000 A.D., about the time of the First Crusade. And so what we need to do is look before that and see this Babylonian banking practice had pretty much continued unabated up to about that time, when a group called the Seljuk Turks started. They were militant Muslims, and they started raising armies, and they started moving on Persia. They eventually took over Babylon and started pressing to take, and actually they took Jerusalem, and that was the trigger for the First Crusade at the end of the thousands, in about 1060 or something like that. And that, curiously, is when we see the Rodanites, who had come out of Babylon and had their trading offices all over Europe already, were on the move. And what we need to understand is there was a southern trading route for the Silk Road, which went through Persia. But when the Seljuks Turks started taking over that section of Babylon, they were disrupting the Silk Road. They were using the Silk Road, but they were disrupting it for the Radhanites in the west part of the western part of Europe. And so the curious thing is that is when we magically see the Ashkenazi Jew, I think, invented. I think that the Radhanites, who are well known in Europe to be Babylonian, needed to change their identity, and they needed to create a new route for the Silk Road to Europe. And they had already convinced the Khazarians to convert to Judaism or some form thereof. And so they had already started developing that northern trade route, which then became the primary trade route for Europe after that, after the Seljuk Turks took over Babylon. And so I think what we're seeing is the way the Babylonian bankers, I won't call them Jewish because I don't think they were, used the term Ashkenazi Jew as a way to hide their real activity as they moved all over Europe. And here's the other key thing. Did they just go into the banking, or did they in fact take over the crown heads of Europe in all those city-states and among the crowns? What we're thinking now is the Radhanites actually not only took over banking in Europe, but they also took over the crowns of Europe. And so out of that, we see at least two or more Jewish fake messiahs emerge, Sabbaty, and then a century later, we saw Jacob Frank, and that was at the time of Mayor Amschel Rothschild. And so what we're now discovering is the story we've learned about the Jewish diaspora was in fact always a banking march throughout Europe, and it was Babylonian based, had nothing to do with Judaism. Judaism was what they were hiding behind in order to finesse the Christian understanding not to charge usury, the work that the Templars were doing to make that happen, and then the way they were crushed by the Pope in exchange for a deal with the Knights of St. John, which now is the Knights of Malta, to give the Pope access to all of his lands uh, in exchange for allowing the Templars to be crushed. And so that was all about banking again. So we're seeing how Mammon moved into Europe and then eventually moved into the US. And that's amazing that we could see this thread that's so well documented when you actually know where to start looking. But as you said, with the histories, they're all over the place. And now we're starting to be able to read a bad history, a fake history, in the way the historian writes, the way they try to confuse the reader, as opposed to people that are clear and are trying to get to the truth. We even have a British knight who, in 1947, I believe, wrote about the Ashkenazi Jews, and he said, this may be the biggest hoax of history for all time. And this guy was no friend of anybody that we know. He was a socialist. He was a Zionist. He became a knight somehow for his work, and yet he called it a hoax. And I think that's what we're seeing. It was the Babylonian takeover of banking in the world was the biggest hoax, and they did it under the guise of being Jewish.
And it is the most effective cabal, syndicate, mafia, whatever you wish to call it, in history, and still goes to this day. And we've now proven that they actually hold this money and where they hold it. So the Silk Road went all the way to the west until it went into the cloud. The money stolen from most of the nations goes to offshore accounts. If we had what they know is the end of a 49-year period, 7 periods for a jubilee in a row, we on September 24th, they say, we entered into that 50th year. So we're supposed to be in the Shamhita, the
50th or 70th?
It's 49, 7 times 7, 49, plus then
Okay.
that next year, the whole year,
Mhm.
is the year of total forgiveness. Well, that's when the fake Jews of the World Economic Forum have called for the reset, isn't it? They're pushing as hard as they can, and they say that it's all timed according to Jewish festivals. And so they, if you're in on the inside and you understand Yiddish, or in the old days, or you understand this language they speak now of the fake Jews, which is not Hebrew, then you can see that these people are able to obfuscate, propagandize, conflate, confabulate it. They are the masters at it, because why? All their life, since they started worshiping Mammon, they were called Jews. Now, Jew
Yep.
generally in Babylon was considered to be generally a name of saying, you disgusting moneymonger. It isn't referring to Judah, because that's one of the tribes. What about the rest of the tribes?
Right.
So the Jew, when you say Jew, you're actually saying a Babylonian derogatory name for what we're calling fake Jews. But then they became the merchants. And look at how they took the great great grandson of Noah, Ashkenaz, who they all came down, of course, in the ark on top of Mount Ararat in Turkey, where they say that all of a sudden the Ashkenaz, they now say that's where they came
Emerged.
from. No,
Right.
wrong. You've demonstrated where they've come from.
By the way, that those cities are only a 30-day walk from Babylon.
And when the sons of Noah spread out, Ashkenaz was there in what we'd call Transcaucasian in eastern Turkey, and then they went north. Well, that's where the Khazarians went. And so if you say the Khazarians are trying to say that they're the Ashkenazi original Hebrews from Noah, that's complete nonsense. They adopted that as a shield to sneak in on all of the Roman routes, as I pointed out, in Italy, particularly through Lucca. And of course, we haven't even mentioned the Sephardi, the Arab, the North. There's also the Sephardi in Portugal and parts of Italy, and in mostly through Spain, but also there's the uh, Mishnazi, which is all North Africa. They actually have multiple names. And then there was all of the ones left in in Palestine. There was no diaspora of the Jews by the Romans in 70 AD. That's a complete myth. And
Yeah.
why? Because they've always been hiding the fact that they are considered a dirty Jew. And I don't mean that as a dirty Hebrew. I mean that as someone's going to lend you money knowing you can never pay it back and put you in jail.
Right. I mean,
That's what we're dealing with.
isn't what human being would not be ticked off at that system? And what they've done is they conflated the anger that people feel about somebody who would do that something to them with being Jewish, and they have no connection. That's the amazing thing that we're discovering here, is that this word has been so maligned and used to confuse people that we don't see the God of Mammon here. We don't see these purveyors of compound interest that had nothing to do with being the children of Israel. Nothing. And in
You've heard,
fact,
yeah.
the prophets of Israel railed against it. And yet they're railing against these very people for whom there is a exquisite detail in clay tablets from Babylon that have been read. They've been known for 150 years, and they specifically describe these banking practices, which even the historian 150 years ago said, well, this sounds exactly like what they're doing in 1888. And in fact, this one historian, she called them the Babylonian Rothschilds, these two families that they discovered. So there we have an awareness. She said that most people think that the banking was the domain of the medieval Jewish families, when in fact I'm reading here 20 centuries earlier, the same practices. Now, she didn't take it anywhere, but she did, I think, accurately observe what was happening.
These are economic predator invaders. And I've always said, and one of the reasons that we got so deep into this is because I had said so many times, there are no more 100% Hebrews in the whole world. There's not a single one. And if you don't have a man and a woman, then you can't have a man and a woman 100% Hebrew. You can't have the Messiah. That's what the Old Testament tells us. And I've said this all along. So whether you're Hasidic or whether you think you're Ashkenazi or whether you think you're whatever you think you are as a Jew, stop. Stop calling yourself Jew. Call yourself, I'm 2% Hebrew. Okay. Now, if you really want to do that, but here's why. Here's why they don't mind being called a Jew. Now, personally, that is a derogatory, racist remark. And yet we use it every single day. We even use the phrase, he Jewed me. Oh my, I got Jewed at the store. Jew, 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 Jew. That isn't Hebrew. The Hebrew people are 100% different than what we now call Jews. And when they mixed with the Khazarians and these fake when they claimed to be Ashkenazi, what they were saying is, we have so lost.
Can I add? You jumped over when they mixed with the Khazarians. I think you need to hyphenate that. Khazarians, Sogdians, Persians. Let's get accurate now, because that's confusing.
And Scythians. Don't forget the Scythians.
Well, yeah, and Scythians, of course.
We're all Scythians.
Yes.
And the Scythians are Celts. So if we really want to go back and dissemble this, you're going to have a tremendous problem, because they put a lot of roadblocks in your way to understand this. But once you do understand it, it's as clear as the nose on my face or on a Sogdian nose, because a Sogdian nose, in all of the sculptures and all the pictures, and they did a lot of the Sogdians.
The Smithsonian has a great description of the Sogdian culture.
And remember, Marco Polo did not bring this stuff to us. The Sogdians did.
Right.
Most of the technology of Europe that came out of China came through the Sogdians and the Rhodians, or who, when they're on the Silk Road, they were also called Burkhara.
Right.
Notice they change their name all the time, like British shill companies. It's unbelievable. You cannot keep track of these supposed Jews. Now, I'm going to tell you the way to image it. The way to image it is that in every single one of the countries that is touched by the Silk Road and the trades of the Hanseatic League, which was really a Khazarian invasion of Europe under the auspices of also having their Ashkenazi buddies, their Jews, and their conquering warriors who then
We probably
became,
need to say Babylonian.
yeah, they became the kings, the monarchs of Europe. And then there
Yeah.
was a division between what? The Jews, the pagans, and the Christians, northern and southern. And so then the Jews came up out of the Rhine, supposed Jews, fake Jews, came up out of the Rhine, the Ashkenazis, up into the north, started the Hanseatic League, which controlled trade after the collapse of the Silk Road, even during the collapse of the Silk Road. So this never went anywhere. These are the same people doing the same thing.
When you say collapse of the Silk Road, um, did it really collapse, or what we see was a natural progression from land routes to sea routes? And so, as the Germans and the British and the French and the Portuguese improved their ships, they started sailing to China, but they went by sea instead of by land. But they continued. I mean, as we know, the Boston Brahmins were one of the leaders of the opium trade from Turkey around Africa to China. So I don't think their interest in China faded at all. I don't think it collapsed. I think it was added to by the shipping.
It became the Hanseatic League, the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Swedish East India Company,
Right,
and they all went for the same things they were getting from the Silk Road.
right.
And who started that really? That was when the Khazarians, under the auspices of Ashkenazis, came into Europe. They mixed with what were the Swedes, and then they
Mm.
became the Lombards in Lubeck and in Hanover and in Hamburg and all those northern German cities, which had yet become truly
And Polish.
and
Well,
Polish and
Sweden
the
attacked
whole
Poland
Baltic.
many times.
The whole
Right.
Baltic. They controlled it. They were also called Varangians or the Rus, and they came right down into the Khazarian land, into Kiev, and basically created the royal line of the Rus, who then conquered the Khazarians. So you're right. How did they come down? On boats. How did the Hanseatic League work? Boats. Who were they? They were Swedes, they were Norsemen, and they came into Germany, changed their name to Lombards, went all the way down into Italy, took over what were called Jews at the time in Venice, who were basically the money mongers, the bankers supporting the Crusades. In other words, don't forget that these Jew merchants started wars so they could sell their goods
You
to
mean these
both
Babylonian
sides.
merchants?
Thank you. Not Rodhanians. We should, if
Right.
we get so technical, we'd have to have the
We
Jewish
need
Rodhanians,
to.
the
We need a new
Hebrew.
language. We need a new language, Douglas. That's your challenge. You got to come up with a new language for us, because we can't use the word Jew. It doesn't mean anything, and it's used generally as an epithet. And what we see is that these Babylonian bankers have hidden behind that term and use anti-Semitism. They're not Semites, but they use the term anti-Semitism as this shield, as this propaganda mechanism to prevent anybody, any researcher from actually digging in and finding out the things that we're finding out.
Yet it's the same methodology, and we have traced it, and you and the miners have traced it back to basically a British monarchy being served by a court Jew, the Rothschilds, and his cronies. And so you have the crown agents and the basically then what we're calling the fake Jew agents, and they control the world right now, and
So here's
there's
a
no getting
question.
out of it.
Here's a question. Why? That seems kind of confusing. Why would they do it that way? And I mean, I'm welcome ideas here, but what strikes me is that once we saw the Ashkenazi Radhanites begin to take over banking in Europe, the question is, were they satisfied with just being the bankers, or did they actually want to be the crowns? And are we, in fact, not looking at, in the crowns of Europe, the black monarchies and the current monarchies, actual Radhanites who cut a deal with their brothers, Radhanites, and we're going to say, we're going to call you Jews, and we're going to let you be the bankers, because we as Christians are not allowed to charge usury. But you, wink, wink, my brothers are allowed to charge usury, so we're gonna cut this deal with you so that you supply us, you charge the interest, then our hands are clean, and then by the way, we've got some shell companies on the back end where you can feed us. And that seems to be, well, that is the system that's operating today. So that seems to have been the system they've used all along. So they found in their activity over the last several millennia that the best way to be the permanent bankers was not to be the crown, but be the bankers and then infiltrate the crowns. And so as they changed, we continue. We became the consistent administrator, kind of like we know the Pilgrim Society are running what most people want to call the deep state, and they don't know why they don't want to use the term because it exists. But anyway, that they figured out that that's the way they manage from the back of the room, and they have learned through history to manage from the back of the room and to call themselves what they aren't, to call themselves Jews. Okay, fine, everybody's going to hit on us, but then we can use anti Semitism as a permanent protection against anybody criticizing us.
And if they criticize
Wow.
and they, we're told that there were pogroms after pogroms after pogroms
Yeah.
in the Frankish kingdom, in the Gaulish kingdom, in the German kingdom. What was that? That could have just been them having their own year of jubilee when they said, "Oh yeah, all the money that we owed everybody, we're out of here now because you're creating a pogrom." But it is so clear that as we've been researching, that if you trace back the houses and the lineages of the leaders, the rulers of the monarchs of England, of Europe, what are you going to find? Mythical inventions that somehow they're special so that they can get the divine right of kings. The Merovingians, they descended from a mermaid. And so you have, half of the houses practically in Northern Europe descended from the princes saying they married Melusina, or many names for her. So they all married this witch, this fairy being who could fly. Or on the other, and what is that? That's the fake excuse for why they have the divine right of kings. But really, what was it? It was the ultimate warriors, the Khazarians, merging with the other ultimate warriors, or the ultimate land warriors, the Khazarians merging with the ultimate water warriors, the Vikings, the Norse, in the northern part of Europe, and
Yeah,
basically
they did.
taking over the whole thing. Why? Charles Martel, the entire Carolingian, leading into the Habsburgian, all of them, the Hanoverian, all of them. What were they? They were usually descended from mythical beings or from the captain of the guard, the top
Right.
warrior.
Yeah, there was no blood inheritance there. That was who was the best warrior took over the business. So what did they do? It seems to me they cut the deals with the Rodenites. The Rodenites said, "Okay, we're going to call ourselves Christian, and we're going to be the crowns, and you're going to be our bankers." And wouldn't it be amazing that if it's the same people, and that the reason Mammon has been so successful is because they were successful at doing that in the Christian world.
Oh, also, the Sephardic practices of the Hebrew nation are close to the original practices, right? But when the Ashkenazi, who I like to call Ashkenazis, because Nazi is the name Nazi,
Right.
Ashkenazis, these Ashkenazis wouldn't follow the ritual of the Spanish Sephardic Jews, which had also controlled all of North Africa all the way back to Palestine. No, no. They invented a new one out of Italy from the city of Lucca through this family, the Colomassians. And then they spread that into the Rhone, into the Rhine, into North Germany. Why? So that they would have their own version of their own supposed Hebrew practice. And then they would have their own language, Yiddish, which was a continuation of a merchant language that controlled the Silk Road that then finally went all the way into Europe. And then
Right.
throughout the entire kingdom, all kingdoms where the Jews were found. Now, or the fake Jews were found. Ahasuerus was the wandering Jew. Why? In every single nation where the Jews are, is their own version of that story. their own name, great details, because they're describing the fact that these militant, economic, fascist, predator Jew merchants were hated
Fake Jew.
everywhere and were
Fake Jew.
pushed, fake Jews, and that they were tax collectors and they were
Yeah.
money mongers and they were warmongers. And so
Right.
people pushed them on from place to place
Yeah,
to
who-
place. And every nation has its own story of the wandering Jew.
I mean,
Why?
how many
That's what they
days
deserve to be.
how many days a week are you going to stand by pure evil and not get angry and want to get them away from your family?
Exactly.
And what we're talking about are fake Jews here. We're not talking about Jews. We're not talking about Jewish people. We're talking about this Babylonian mechanism governed or guided, possessed by the demon of Mammon that plagues us to this day. And by the way, they have a name with the international activity, and that's called the Pilgrim Society, because that's where it resides right now in London. And we've got to recognize that. And then, what do you think is going to happen in London when the day of Jubilee is called and all the debts are forgiven? Going to collapse a whole lot of offshore banks.
The new globalist Yiddish are carbon credits.
Mhm.
It's the new currency for the entire global control of the Jewish merchants who control the world and have as much money in
Fake
offshore
Jew.
accounts as fake Jews as there is currency in all of the currencies in the world. Because
Right.
these people, these predator, fascist, economic, globalist, Jew merchant, tax collecting, killer,
Fake Jew.
murderers, warmongers. Same story we've been telling you now for years. Same people who went after Leader Technologies, same exact people. So when you're talking about the asset managers, BlackRock, no, you're talking about these people. When you're talking
Yeah.
about the big bankers, you're talking about these people.
Exactly.
When you're talking about every stock market in the world, it's these people. When you're talking about the control of every international organization, including the World Economic Forum, it's these people. And we
Same
have
people.
now given full disclosure on it. As far as I know, in all the research I've done for all this time, especially in comparative religions, which I started when I was a teenager, no one's ever explained this before, but this is the truth, folks. This is full disclosure. Now you know who keeps you in your debt prison, even though there are no bars. You're in debt prison, folks, because they control all the mechanisms. And now they want to have a tighter control. And so I guess that's why we were given and led to reveal this to everyone, to shine light on it so we can disinfect these scumbags.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've heard the term the whore of Babylon. And it's pretty evident to me now, after reading all this history, that the bankers of Babylon, who we have exquisite detail for, are still operating to this day. They have passed that demon from father to son and from father to daughter. To this day, they never gave up power. They never went away. At all times, they were financing both sides of every war they were ever in. So they always ingratiated themselves in with people as they moved along in history. They made up stories to protect themselves. Many times they hid behind the idea that they were Jewish, but they weren't. And that became a mechanism that they were very successful at in Christian Europe. And as they began to take over the economies of Christian Europe, they didn't totally subdue the church and Christians, and that's what they're trying to wipe out now. Because who else is going to, besides religious Jews who would call for the year of Jubilee, Christians would all call for the year of Jubilee, and I think that is going to be what finally defeats Mammon in our world today.
And to prove it to you, the Babylonian Mammon worshippers in 1913 created a few things. One thing they created took all of our money from us and put us into debtor prison, which is Social Security, IRS.
Right.
They take sometimes as much as a third of your income before you get it. That is a tax created by these Babylonian Mammon worshippers. Second thing they created was the Federal Reserve. so they could hypothecate all the money you're going to earn in your life and control it, and then create $31 trillion worth of debt, fake debt. So they can have fake debt, but I, as a person, can't have any debt, or they'll put me in prison, or if I write a bad check. And the
Right.
third thing they created was the FBI to make sure to cover up all the crimes of those two first groups and make sure to cover up any crime that the feds commit. So the feds are in control. So when you say feds in America, the federal government are these people. Every
Okay,
politician.
you can't say FBI without saying MI5 and MI6 in England,
Thank you very
because
much.
they're the ones that created MI5,
Absolutely.
the FBI.
And they are the Babylonian mammon worshippers. And what else was
Correct.
created at the same time? And this, I'll close with this. The Anti-Defamation League was created to protect the Jews who had created the Federal Reserve, the
Fake
IRS,
Jews.
and the fake Jews, and the FBI. Okay? So these people are still doing it now. We are in an ironclad system. We are in the Hammurabi Code is basically a code that creates slavery. We're still underneath its auspices.
We
and
are.
It's the same people who are still doing it to us. And so when they say, yes, they're all Ashkenazi Jews, now you know that's just a bunch of nonsense. When they say, well, they're Sephardic, or they're Khazarian, or they're what is called National Zionism. Well, if they were National Zionist and Khazarian, they didn't have to be put in a concentration camp. So who are these people? They're not Jews. So you have given full disclosure on the true nature of fake Jews. And I personally cannot thank you enough, because it now solves this gigantic problem I've had for many years of trying to find the true origins and what it is that drives these people even beyond their own lives and the lives of their children. It's the worship of demons.